So we'll move on to our next speaker, and that's Frank Dempsey, and he'll tell us about his recent merry-go-round observatory project. Take it away, Frank.
Okay, thanks, Paul. And I'm broadcasting from Pickering, Ontario. And the title of the presentation is about my merry-go-round observatory that I've been working on for the past several years. And so the story begins, or this presentation begins, with a question that somebody posted on an astronomy forum a few years ago, asking if anybody had built these merry-go-round observatories that were first publicized or actually built by Leslie Peltier quite a few years ago. And so let's have a quick look at the page from Scientific American magazine from decades ago, where he called it the merry-go-round observatory, or at least that's what the magazine editor wanted to call it. And so we could start off by saying, is everybody familiar with who Leslie Peltier is? Maybe not, since he passed away a few decades ago, and he was well known before that. So just as a quick note about Leslie Peltier, he was a famous comet discoverer and amateur astronomer and variable star observer for the AVSO, or American Association of Variable Star Observers. And so he was pretty active as an amateur astronomer with his backyard telescopes and backyard observatory. So that's just a quick background of who Leslie Peltier was. He was well known years ago. He might be best known for a book that he wrote, authored, called Starlight Nights. And the book Starlight Nights is now out of print, but probably exists in quite a few astronomy club libraries. So anyway, let's have a quick look at a closer illustration in that magazine article about his observatory. So you can probably see at a glance, it seems to be a circular track on the ground and has a frame that rotates on top of it. 4 wheels, it looks like in this case. The notes at the bottom left indicate it's from a children's merry-go-round. And so it's probably from the era when it might have been from, say, Sears catalog or something like that, and people would buy them and build them for their children. And of course, the steel structure would be left lying around after children stopped being children and they were long gone and moved away. And maybe these were surplus, and Leslie Peltier found one and put it to use. And he's got some other surplus parts here, automotive parts, maybe steering wheel and seat, maybe. But the point here is that he has a platform rotating on a circular track. And he has a telescope mounted on a framework that allows him to basically sit still or at least move around in his chair and observe the sky, whether he's observing comets or variable stars. And the hut rotates, and that's one way to move the telescope wherever you want it. So that's what he did, and that's become known as the merry-go-round observatory. So a lot of details in here about the opening of the hut and where it's going to be pointed and how to balance the telescope and so on. I should point out one little detail is that the telescope mentioned here is a 6-inch refractor, and I have a 6-inch refractor, a 6-inch f8 refractor, and it's pretty darn heavy, and it requires a pretty substantial amount to hold it. So I'm a little surprised to see it's this fairly light framework holding his 6-inch telescope. Anyway, that's that. So some details to point out. It's an enclosed hut rotating on a circular track. The telescope is mounted on an alt-azimuth type mount in front of the seated observer, and your observer manually turns a wheel to turn the structure. So the hut rotates. There's some other details there too, but those are the main details that are in the merry-go-round observatory. And so couldn't say why. And so I see it as being for visual observing only. Fine for a comet hunter, somebody that looked for comets half a century ago with an alt-azimuth mounted telescope scanning the sky near the horizon, for instance, or observing variable stars or other stars. Anyway, for visual observing. And an enclosed hut reduces hassles for observing, like biting insects and dew and wind chill, which can be a nuisance. So if you can reduce them with an enclosed hut, that's a great advantage and great reason to build some sort of observatory. Now I said it's for visual observing, but if you don't like star hopping with star charts, then you don't have to waste your time doing that. You can simply buy an automatic telescope. Here's one from Unistellar, waiting to take your money, take thousands of dollars, and save you the trouble of bothering to star hop your way around the sky looking for targets. So you can go this option if you want to, but otherwise, as I mentioned, this project is for visual observing, and it requires star hopping and charts, and it's not for photographic or imaging, and it's not a high power planetary sort of telescope. Anyway, on to my version. My concept was, when I set aside some time and a little bit of budget to try to build one, it would be made of wood, which is low cost, easy to work with, and I have lots of scrap wood lying around to use. And in my case, the platform could rotate on caster wheels sitting on the ground. That's because I happen to have a few wheels lying around, surplus from some other project. And the hut would sit on the platform with a telescope mounted on the side of the hut. So that sounds straightforward. So my initial plan was to use an old equatorial mount and just simply mount it to one side of the wall, from one side of the hut, which isn't built yet. So it's just a platform. And here I've got an A-frame mounted to the platform. The hut, the observatory or hut, whether it's a frame holding mosquito netting or a plywood structure or whatever, is all trivial compared to the initial problem of building a rotating platform. Anyway, here you see the A-frame on the side, and the equatorial mount is mounted onto that. And you see a bar here, it's placed diagonally, on which the telescope will be mounted, and approximately at eye level for a seated observer on that platform. And there's some slow motion controls on it. So that's the first version that I built. And so it seemed okay. So this little telescope here is a 4-inch reflector that I built. Convenient little size telescope, not very heavy, works pretty well. And this is one version, so you can see how the sheet of plywood on the base just, you can't see the wheels in this image, but you can in the next image. It rotates, turns around. The A-frame will eventually have a hut built around it and hold the telescope, and that's my version for how to build a merry-go-round observatory. So, and some other details here. You can see how these 3 caster wheels are sitting on the ground on its own separate little platform, and there's a pivot bar going up through the middle, serving as a pivot, so the platform will simply rotate around that pivot on the wheels, and the wheels will support it. So the wheels are heavy duty enough. They did a reasonable job, so nothing bent or flexed or got into any problems, and so that worked pretty well, or at least it seemed to work reasonably well with trials with that little telescope and my body weight sitting on the chair, so it worked pretty well. It seems okay, and it works and it rotates without problem. There's no turning mechanism installed yet. That's simply a matter of installing some pulleys or possibly a bicycle chain or a rope with pulleys to turn the platform. Vibrations are minor and acceptable. There are some vibrations, of course. If I look at high enough magnification, you can see my pulse and heartbeat shaking through the telescope. But the telescope can be pointed at most of the sky without problem. Maybe not so near the horizon. But so it's worthwhile to check into any other versions that might have existed that people might have built. And so, yes, this is the Bill Volna version from the 1980s, early 1990s. So he was an observer in Minnesota who built this version. It's actually a little trailer that he pulled around with his pickup truck and set up, erected. And that telescope on the side is a 6-inch refractor. And so I mentioned that my own 6-inch refractor, medium refractor, is heavy duty enough. It requires a substantial structure to hold it. And that's fine because Bill spent 2 or 3 years building this, according to the Sky and Telescope article, also in telescope making. One point to illustrate before I move on to the next slide is that one feature here is that the eyepiece is fixed. So the eyepiece stays at a fixed position in front of the observer. You see him seated on his chair or bench inside. It's a really handy feature to have the eyepiece at a fixed level. So you can see some more details here. The Sky and Telescope article indicated how it's made of welded steel, and it took several years to build it. And I agreed it's got to be pretty heavy duty to hold that 6-inch refractor. Anyway, that is one version, the Bill Volna version from early 1990s. There were several other versions I noticed in Sky and Telescope. Somebody in Colorado built a rotating structure and held a big Dobsonian, maybe 13 or 16-inch sort of Dobsonian. And that's one version. I saw another article where somebody built a welded steel track similar to the original merry-go-round observatory. It's a lot of work, in my opinion. So, but that's fine. This is one way of doing it. So anyway, back to my version, made of wood and so on. I noticed you can find a lot of images online for Dobsonian style binocular holders. So I started to look into that and to make some for my own binoculars. And I ended up with making this. Instead of having the little equatorial mount mounted on the A-frame, I put a little shelf and mounted this little Dobsonian style mount. And then I like the idea of the fixed eyepiece. And so here I've got the eyepiece from that small Newtonian telescope. In this case, it's the 5-inch telescope. Aligned right through the altitude bearing of the Dobsonian mount here. So that's pretty handy. It is a fixed eyepiece position, so that's pretty handy. So I like this better than the equatorial mount. So this allows some movement in azimuth, so that wherever it's pointed, I don't need to rotate the hut to turn it, say, 5 degrees. It can gain about 20 or 30 degrees of azimuth along the horizon, turning just on this little Dob-mounted tiny little platform here. So here's a few more details to give you some idea of what I mean. It's just a Dob mount, can rotate on that little shelf mounted onto the A-frame on the side of the hut. And it's, I could point out also it's a 3-point Dob instead of a 4-point, but minor detail there. So those are some little details of it. And you see a few more details here with the small reflector, and it balances pretty well, and it's easy to balance a small telescope there, but it just gives you some idea of how its telescope is mounted there. So that's all straightforward. But a bit later, I realized I could just use that little altazimuth Dob mount on a separate tripod. And so a little tripod with that mount on it is portable and much less work and cost and maintenance than actually building it onto the side of a hut. So here's my current situation. So in this case, it's got a pair of binoculars. So you see a Vixen cell dovetail mounted onto the binoculars, a dovetail base on the Dob base, and it's sitting on a tripod. And I just carry the, in this case, binoculars mounted onto that Dob cell mount. Just plunk it down onto the cradle on the tripod. Similar for other telescopes. I may have a few other pictures of some other telescopes, 4 and 5-inch style Newtonians. But anyway, that gives you some idea of my current setup. And I find it pretty easy to use, pretty easy, pretty portable to use, and plunk it down anywhere. So a few more images here just give you some idea of the unit in operation. And there are some trees around. So the top image shows the little patio stone platform I had designated to use for that little merry-go-round observatory if I built it. And I have a few other of my other telescopes in the background. And there are uses for telescope observatories when you have bigger telescopes that are not really intended to be portable. They can just sit in a little hut on their little stone. And so there is room for that in my property. I could put it here, but there are trees around. There is light pollution. There are good reasons why it's easier to carry around that little tripod mounted unit, plug it down anywhere I want. So it's actually quite a bit easier to use that way. And so if I ask, is the merry-go-round observatory worthwhile or feasible? And so yes, it could be stable enough for visual observations. As I mentioned, for I may have mentioned for variable star observations and double star observations, it would be pretty good. As long as it's not intended to be used for too high of a magnification, which you can't normally use on an altazimuth mount anyway. But building a hut requires some construction cost and maintenance and ground space. That's fine. Maybe it's worthwhile. I could do that, but maybe it's worthwhile, maybe not. But it probably was a good idea when surplus children's merry-go-round tracks were common. As I may have mentioned, maybe they were from the Sears catalog or something, half a century ago. Maybe they were more common. But maybe they were pieces of scrap metal left lying around, eventually to be picked up and used for some purpose. So maybe in that case, it might have been worthwhile to build this. In my case, I decided the portable tripod version is easy to use, and it's really fun to use for small telescopes, 5 inches and smaller. So it's quite convenient. So for my circumstances, I decided that the portable tripod version is preferable to the hut. And that's why I didn't, excuse me, that's why I didn't go any further on that merry-go-round observatory. So it's not totally scrapped. I could continue with it someday, but for now, I decided using my binoculars and small telescopes is much more fun to use on that little portable tripod version than building it on a stationary hut. So that's the presentation, and anybody has any comments or questions or suggestions, I'll be glad to hear them. Anyway, that's the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Frank. And we typically go to questions, but I'm told that Frank's internet connection just dropped. So we won't be able to take any questions right now.